June 24, 1945. The cobblestones of Red Square still hold the cold of a Moscow morning. But the air is already trembling, not from wind, from anticipation, from something older and heavier than weather, from history arriving on schedule, exactly as planned. Hundreds of thousands of eyes are locked on the Spasskaya Tower. Every breath is held. Every heart is suspended between this moment and the next. And then he appears. A white horse, an Orlov trotter, a breed so noble, so precisely beautiful, it seems less like a living animal and more like a sculpture that stepped down from its own pedestal and decided to make history walk beside it. Every muscle is defined. Every step is calculated. Every movement is the movement of something that was never random and was never meant to be. On the horse, a man in a marshal's uniform. His chest blazes with gold. Decorations stacked upon decorations. A galaxy of metal and ribbon that tells, in the official language of power, exactly who this person is supposed to be. His face is hard. The cheekbones are heavy, angular. The eyes look like they were carved from Ural granite by someone who didn't believe in softness. He receives the victory parade. He is the symbol. And in this single cinematic moment, a myth is born. The myth of a simple peasant boy from the village of Zhukov'S, Kaluga province, who traveled from apprentice furrier to commander of the fronts that crushed the Third Reich. The myth of the ideal Soviet man. No privileges, no connections, no patrons, only will, only talent, only faith in the communist idea. The official biography is immaculate. Born December 1, 1896, into the family of a cobbler. Father: Konstantin Artemyevich, a simple craftsman. Mother: Ustinya Artemyevna, a day laborer. Poverty, hunger. At 11 years old, sent as an apprentice to a furrier in Moscow. World War I, an ordinary cavalry soldier. The Revolution, crossing to the side of the Reds. The Civil War, commander of a squadron. Then military academies, command positions, ranks, medals, glory. Everything logical. Everything clear. Everything perfectly arranged. Everything too smooth. Too. Because when you look at this biography carefully, when you begin to count, to compare, to verify, questions appear. Inconvenient questions. Questions that Soviet historiography answered with either silence or ideological stamp work. Questions that were buried not once, but repeatedly, deliberately, with the full weight of a state apparatus that specialized in the burial of inconvenient things. Why did a boy from a starving village end up in the cavalry? The cavalry was the most expensive, most prestigious branch of the Russian Imperial Army. It cost 3 to 4 times more to maintain a cavalryman than a foot soldier. A horse, the uniform, the harness, the weapons, training in horsemanship, the care of the animal, all of this required not just money, it required connections. A hand that pushed things in the right direction. The son of a cobbler, by definition, could not have possessed such connections, but he did. Why was he, an enlisted man of the Tsar's army, not shot during the Revolution? Why was he not sent to the camps, not held under suspicion, not subjected to the paranoid vetting that the Bolsheviks applied to thousands of former Tsarist military personnel? Why was he instead given command positions? Why was he trusted? Why was he promoted? Why, after the death of Marshal Zhukov on June 18, 1974, did KGB officers burst into his home with a speed that suggested they were not retrieving the private archive of a retired military hero, but the access codes to a nuclear arsenal? What were they looking for? What did they so desperately fear they might find, or fear that others might find first? Pause. The sound of a needle on an old vinyl record, then quiet. The Soviet state was an artist, not of painting, not of music, not of sculpture, though it claimed mastery over all three. It was an artist of biography, of official life. It had elevated the editing of human existence into a science. Inconvenient facts were erased. White spaces were filled with the correct formulations. Nuance was flattened. Complexity was ironed out until it lay smooth and acceptable and entirely false. Zhukov was not simply a hero. He was the primary hero, the face of victory, the icon of the regime itself. And because of this, precisely because of this, his biography had to be not merely clean, but spotless, absolute, unimpeachable. And the state deployed colossal resources to ensure that spotlessness. Resources too large, suspiciously large. Here is a principle that any serious investigator learns early. When a system spends enormous energy redacting someone's history, that expenditure is itself the evidence. You do not spend that much effort on emptiness. You spend it on something dangerous, something that, if seen clearly, would unravel not just one story, but the entire architecture of narratives built upon it. Something that had to be buried so deeply that no one would ever think to dig. Imagine a photograph. The official portrait, perfectly composed, perfectly lit. The hero at the center, the background neutral, empty, correct. Every element in its proper place. But photographs are edited by cutting, not by creation. When you remove figures from an image, you can take away their faces, but you cannot take away the space they occupied. The light still falls the way it fell when they were there. The shadows still point in directions that only make sense if someone was standing there a moment before. The contours remain, the absences remain. The people who were cut out of Zhukov's photograph did not disappear. They left outlines, voids, shadows at the edges of the frame. And if you look carefully, if you train yourself to see what the image is trying to not show you, those shadows coalesce into silhouettes, into figures, into faces. Who stood behind Zhukov when the official portrait was taken? Who was so carefully erased from the image? That is the question this investigation exists to answer. The genealogical tree of Georgy Zhukov is not merely a collection of names and dates. It is a map. A map of connections, of influence, of who knew whom, of who was owed what, of who could lean on whom when the weight of the world pressed down. In Tsarist Russia, and then in the Soviet Union, a family history was never simply personal. It was a political document, a ledger of alliances. The state understood this instinctively, which is why it so ferociously controlled access to the archives, the registry books, the church records, the pre-revolutionary census data. All of it was classified, not because it contained military secrets, but because it contained names. The names of those who were present, the names of godparents, the names of witnesses, the names of guarantors, the names of those who gave money and connections and opportunities, the names of those who transformed a boy from Strelkovka into a marshal of the Soviet Union. And here is where the investigation becomes genuinely urgent, because what little has seeped out of those archives, what scattered testimonies have survived, what logical contradictions have persisted despite decades of institutional whitewashing, all of it assembles piece by piece into a different picture. A picture that does not fit the official narrative. A picture that explains the meteoric career, the strange financial stability of a supposedly destitute family, and the peculiar deference that even hostile Soviet power consistently showed toward Zhukov, even in his periods of disgrace. A picture that reveals, behind the simple peasant boy stood forces that were never meant to be spoken of aloud. Consider the money. The official biography tells us about poverty, about a cobbler father who barely made ends meet, about a mother who labored as a day worker, about a hungry childhood in a village where only the toughest survived. Accept all of this as true. Then ask the simple question, where did the money come from? 11-year-old Georgi is sent to Moscow, to an apprenticeship with a furrier. This is not merely a trip from one town to another. This is the organization of a child's life in an enormous, expensive, unfamiliar city. Housing, food, clothing, tools for learning, payment to the master craftsman for the instruction. In 1907, for a peasant family, these were astronomical sums, not modest expenses, not manageable sacrifices, astronomical. Someone paid, and then more. During World War I, Zhukov enters the cavalry, not the infantry, where they took whoever was available, not the artillery, the cavalry, the elite branch, where sons of nobility and wealthy families served, because the cavalry cost money that ordinary families simply did not possess. Someone made this possible. During the Revolution and the Civil War, chaos reigns. Millions die. Careers shatter. Former Tsarist officers are shot in waves or flee across borders. The Bolsheviks view military specialists from the old regime with the paranoid suspicion of a new power that trusts no one who served the previous one. And yet Zhukov passes through. He is accepted, given command positions, trusted, promoted. While thousands of men with identical backgrounds disappear into unmarked graves or prison cells, Zhukov rises. Someone held an umbrella over him. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision throughout the 1920s and 30s. Elite military academies, institutions that accepted candidates only by recommendation, only with the endorsement of influential figures and at significant financial cost, opened their doors to him. Each successive command appointment, regiment, division, corps, deputy commander of a military district, requires not just skill, but the successful navigation of complex negotiations between competing power factions. Zhukov wins every negotiation, consistently, methodically. Then the purges of 1937 and 1938 arrive. 3 of 5 Soviet marshals are executed. 13 of 15 first and second rank army commanders are executed. 57 of 85 corps commanders are executed. 110 of 195 divisional commanders are executed. The leadership of the Red Army is annihilated with a thoroughness that would be almost impressive if it were not so catastrophic. Zhukov is alive, not merely alive, flourishing, receiving new appointments, growing in authority and access, in a country where men were shot for considerably less, for a phrase in a private letter, for the wrong friendship, for a great-grandfather's faith. Zhukov walks untouched through the most dangerous years in Soviet military history. This is not luck. Luck does not operate at this scale, with this consistency over this many decades. This is protection. Someone above him said the words that needed to be said. This one you do not touch. Someone had invested too heavily in this particular asset to permit its destruction. Soviet power was masterful at constructing heroes. It was an art form raised to industrial scale. The system required symbols, figures who could stand for the idea that the Soviet system produced greatness from ordinary clay. Zhukov was the supreme example of this symbol-making. Simple origins, extraordinary achievement. The living proof that the system worked for everyone, that talent was all that mattered, that the elevator was open to anyone willing to step in and press the right floor. Beautiful, inspiring, and utterly impossible, because the Soviet system never functioned this way. Not once, not for a single moment. The Soviet Union was a state of total scarcity, scarcity of resources, scarcity of opportunity, scarcity of access to education, to career advancement, to power. In conditions where bread was rationed and apartments were shared by 4 families and a coat was something you saved for years to afford, ascending without patronage was not merely difficult. It was statistically inconceivable. The career elevator in the USSR had a very specific mechanism: party membership, social origin, recommendations, connections, mentors. At every level, filters. At every step, verification. No one rose simply on merit. Behind every successful ascent stood someone's will, someone's interest, someone's investment, especially money. And behind Georgy Zhukov, behind the granite face and the immaculate white horse and the medals blazing in the June sun of 1945, stood something that the Soviet state spent half a century concealing with every resource at its disposal. The question is not whether someone stood there. The question is who. The official history tells us Zhukov made himself. The real history whispers something different. Zhukov was made. And it is time, at last, after 80 years of managed silence, to find the hands that made him. There is a building in Moscow that most people walk past without a second thought. A gray administrative block, unremarkable in the way that powerful institutions often make themselves unremarkable, not through absence of resources, but through deliberate aesthetic modesty. Inside this building, in rooms with no windows facing the street, sit archives. Row upon row of folders, boxes, ledgers. Documents organized with the obsessive precision of a system that understood, at its deepest institutional level, that information is not merely knowledge. Information is control. Some of these folders are open to researchers. Most are not. And the ones that are not, the ones sealed behind access restrictions that have survived every political transition, every era of supposed openness, every wave of post-Soviet transparency. Those are the ones that matter. Because a state that continues to protect a secret long after the political need for that secret has dissolved is protecting something different. It is no longer protecting ideology. It is protecting architecture, the invisible structure of how power actually worked as opposed to how power claimed to work. The gap between those two things is where history lives, where the truth hides, where the names are written that were so carefully cut from the photographs. The name of the document type we are searching for is simple. It is ancient. It is a word that, in another context, sounds almost gentle. A metric book. Transition, sound design, church bells, distant from another century. For the modern mind, the phrase metric book carries the musty weight of genealogical hobby research. Thick volumes in leather bindings, filled with faded ink, relevant only to the patient amateur tracing a great-great-grandmother's maiden name through provincial church records. A curiosity, an artifact. But in the Russian Empire, the metric book was something incomparably more powerful. It was the hard drive of the social system, the database in which everything was recorded, births, marriages, deaths, but most critically, connections. Who was bound to whom? Who had formally accepted responsibility for whom? Who had stood as witness at what ceremony? Who had signed as guarantor for what transaction? Who had agreed, in the sight of both God and the state, to serve as a godparent to another family's child? And the godparent, the vospremnik in the old Russian ecclesiastical term, was not merely a ceremonial figure, not a person who holds an infant over a baptismal font and attends a subsequent lunch. In the social architecture of Imperial Russia, the godparent was a guarantor, a patron, a person who accepted, before the community and before the church, material and social responsibility for the future of the child in question. A godparent from a family of influence could alter the entire trajectory of a child's life, could provide access to education, could open doors that for ordinary peasant families were not simply closed, they were invisible. The very existence of such doors was unknown to those who had no one to show them. The selection of godparents was therefore never accidental. It was strategy, investment, a calculated social transaction in which both parties gained something. The poor family gained access to a patron's network. The wealthy or influential family gained something more intangible, but equally valuable: the loyalty of a future adult who would remember for the rest of their life who it was that changed their fate. This was how vertical social mobility actually worked in Imperial Russia. Not through raw talent floating upward through merit like oil through water, through networks, through the carefully maintained web of obligation, loyalty, and mutual interest that connected families across class lines, not with the sentimental warmth of charity, but with the cold precision of investment. Now, December 1st, 1896, the village of Zhukov'S. A country church, cold in the early winter, smelling of candle wax and stone. A priest opens the metric book to a fresh page and begins to write. A male child, given the name Georgi. Parents listed. And then, the entry that matters most. The entry that Soviet biographers would spend decades either omitting entirely or describing with a vagueness that bordered on studied blindness. The godparents. Who stood at the baptismal font of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and accepted, before God and community and the written record of the state, responsibility for this child? The official Soviet biographies almost never say. They mention it in passing, obliquely, without specifics. Historians who pressed on this point found themselves directed toward archives that were conveniently unavailable, documents that were in the process of being restored, records that had unfortunately suffered water damage or fire, or the ordinary entropy of time. Convenient entropy. But inconvenience, in historical investigation, is itself data. A system does not spend energy obscuring information that is harmless. The mere fact that the godparent question was consistently redirected, consistently softened, consistently buried beneath the more cinematic elements of the official biography, the poverty, the hunger, the determination, the talent, tells us that the answer to that question was considered dangerous by someone with the authority to make decisions about what was and was not permitted to appear in published Soviet accounts of Zhukov's life. Consider what such an answer might have revealed. If the godparent of Georgy Zhukov was a local merchant, a man with a shop, with credit lines, with connections to the commercial networks of Kaluga province, the financial mystery of the Moscow apprenticeship begins to resolve. Someone of that standing could organize, as a matter of relatively minor inconvenience, the placement of a godchild in a respectable Moscow trade. The housing, the fees, the introductions. A letter of recommendation to an acquaintance in the city. A note saying, "This boy is mine. See that he is looked after." If the godparent held a position in the local zemstvo, the elected administrative body that governed provincial Russian life in the decades before the revolution, the connections extend further, into regional politics. Into the administrative apparatus that controlled, among other things, who received what kind of official documentation, what classifications were recorded in what ledgers, what version of a man's origins found its way into the permanent record. And if the godparent, or the network of relationships that the godparent represented, extended into the merchant class of Moscow itself, into the commercial and financial world that was, in the late 19th and early 20th century, quietly and profoundly reshaping the economic structure of the entire Russian Empire, then we are looking at something of an entirely different magnitude. We are looking at a door that opens not just onto one man's life, but onto a system. Pause. The sound of footsteps on cobblestone. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. The surname itself is worth examining. Zhukov. In Russian, zhuk, a beetle, a common insect. a surname of the most ordinary peasant derivation, the kind of name that passes entirely unnoticed in a crowd of Komarovs and Mukhin and Vorobyevs and Zaitsevs. The perfect camouflage of unremarkability. And this matters, because the history of Russian surnames is considerably less straightforward than it appears. Before the Emancipation Reform of 1861, the vast majority of Russian peasants had no family surnames at all. They had first names, patronymics, nicknames. Surnames were a feature of the nobility, the clergy, the merchant class, the people who owned property and signed contracts and required, for the functioning of legal and commercial life, a stable, inheritable identifier. When mass surname registration came to the peasantry in the second half of the 19th century, the names were often assigned administratively, derived from a grandfather's nickname or a village's name or a trade or a physical characteristic, and recorded by local officials who were not always careful and were sometimes quite creative. This process created an opportunity that was used throughout the empire by families who had reasons, financial, social, legal, religious, to present a simpler, more unremarkable identity to the official record than the identity they actually carried. The practice had a name among historians, though it is rarely discussed in popular histories: adaptive Russification. The modification or replacement of a family name to something more phonetically and culturally neutral, something that would not attract attention, something that would allow a family to move through the administrative apparatus of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet state without the particular kind of scrutiny that certain names attracted. The Zhukov'S of Strelkovka appeared in the record at a moment when such appearances were entirely possible to arrange, if one had the right connections and the right motivation to do so. This is not accusation. It is observation. It is the kind of observation that serious archival historians make when they notice that a given family's documentary trail begins with unusual neatness at a particular moment in time, and that the trail before that moment is, conveniently, difficult to follow. In the commercial and financial world of late imperial Russia, the families that controlled capital understood something that the aristocracy, with its dependence on land and title, was slower to grasp. The future belonged to networks, not to bloodlines. The future belonged to those who could reach across social and geographic boundaries, place loyal individuals in strategic positions, and build webs of obligation that would function regardless of which political wind happened to be blowing. The great merchant families and financial houses of the empire, the dynasties that financed railways, industrial enterprises, and government loans, were not merely economic actors. They were political actors, and the most sophisticated among them were already in the last decades of the 19th century sensing what was coming. The old system was exhausted. The imperial structure was losing its capacity to hold together the contradictions it had accumulated over centuries. Change was not a possibility. It was a certainty. The only uncertainty was its shape and its timing. And the rational response to an inevitable transformation of the political order is to place representatives within every possible future structure of power. The merchant and financial families of Imperial Russia had long experience with this logic. They maintained relationships with the Orthodox Church, the institution that controlled the metric books. They maintained relationships with the Zemstvo administration, the institution that controlled provincial record-keeping. They maintained relationships with the military establishment, the institution that would determine who controlled the state itself in any period of turbulence. A talented boy from a provincial village, a boy with the right physical qualities, the right temperament, the right combination of intelligence and obedience. A boy whose family happened to be connected, through the godparent network, to people who were themselves connected to larger interests. Such a boy was not a charity case. He was a long-term investment. The cavalry placement, so financially inexplicable if Zhukov's origins were as modest as the official biography claims, makes complete sense within this framework. The cavalry was elite. It was expensive. It was the branch of the military that was most tightly connected to the networks of inherited privilege and commercial influence that had always dominated it. Placing a carefully chosen young man in the cavalry with the right recommendations through the right contacts was not an act of random benevolence. It was the opening move in a long game. And the long game had a specific objective: control of the military. In any system, imperial or revolutionary, czarist or Soviet, the military is not merely one institution among many. It is the institution that determines which other institutions persist. To have a loyal, capable, positioned figure within the upper echelons of military command is to possess an instrument of influence that no amount of money alone can purchase. You need both: the money to place the person to justify the placement, and then patience. The willingness to wait while your investment matures, to protect it through difficulties, to shield it from the purges and the reorganizations and the political storms that will inevitably come, until the moment arrives when your investment yields the return you planned for all along. Sound design, distant artillery rolling like thunder from another era, fading, silence. 1939. Khalkhin Gol, on the border of Mongolia and Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Soviet and Japanese forces have been grinding against each other in a conflict that the world is only half watching, distracted by the far larger catastrophe assembling itself in Europe. Zhukov is given command. What follows is the first genuine exhibition of the operational brilliance that will, in a few years, make his name synonymous with the destruction of German military power. He studies the terrain. He studies the Japanese tactical approach. He builds up supply lines in secret, concealing the true scale of his preparation through a deception operation of considerable sophistication. And then, in August of that year, he strikes, a combined arms assault that encircles and destroys the Japanese Sixth Army with a precision that shocks military observers across the world. The Soviet High Command takes notice. Zhukov is awarded Hero of the Soviet Union. His name, previously known only within military circles, now reaches Stalin's desk. And Stalin looks. Because Stalin always looked. At everyone. He looked for talent, yes. But more urgently, he looked for the network behind the talent. Every capable person who came to his attention was subjected to a scrutiny that went beyond professional assessment. The question Stalin was always really asking was not, can this person do the job? The question was, who sent this person? Whose instrument is this? If I use this person, whose interests do I simultaneously serve? And how do I ensure that those interests remain aligned with my own? Zhukov survived this scrutiny. More than survived. He was given, in January of 1941, the position of Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. Access to every military secret, every strategic plan, every disposition of force across the entire length of an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. You do not give this position to someone you have not thoroughly understood. Stalin understood Zhukov. The question that remains, the question that the metric books and the sealed archives and the KGB's frantic post-mortem search of Zhukov's home all point toward, is what exactly Stalin understood. Because what Stalin understood, and what the state subsequently spent decades concealing, may be the most important hidden chapter in the entire history of the Soviet Union. The names are in the archives. They have always been in the archives. And they are still waiting to be read. Final image: a priest's hand writing in a leather-bound ledger. The ink glistens, still wet. The name of the godparent begins to form, letter by letter, and then the camera pulls back, and the page fades to white before the name is complete. The metric book was never merely a record of who was born. It was a record of who was chosen. And Georgy Zhukov, the boy from Zhukovka, the white horse rider of Red Square, the granite-faced marshal of the victory, was chosen long before anyone in the public record admits. The hands that wrote his name into the ledger of power were not the hands of talent or providence or communist destiny. They were human hands. They had faces, and they had names. There is a specific kind of fear that only archives produce. Not the fear of darkness or of heights or of physical danger. Something quieter, more cerebral. The fear that arrives when you are sitting in a reading room, surrounded by the ordered stillness of preserved documents, and you reach for a folder that the catalog says should be there, and it is not. The folder exists in the index. The index says it exists. The archivists confirm it existed, but the folder itself is absent, removed, transferred to a different classification level, restricted, unavailable for reasons that are never quite specified and never quite satisfying. This kind of absence is not neutral. In the archive of power, an absence is a confession. It is the system admitting, in the only language bureaucracies speak fluently, the language of paperwork, that something was here, and someone decided it should no longer be here. And that decision itself was important enough to leave a trace. The trace of the removal. The ghost of the document in the index entry that survived its elimination. The archive of Georgy Zhukov's life is full of such ghosts. And ghosts properly interrogated tell stories. Transition, sound design, boots on a wooden floor, the creak of a door, the rustle of papers. June 18, 1974. Zhukov is dead. He is 77 years old. He has been ill for years, a series of strokes that diminished progressively the physical force of the man who had once stood on a white horse before 500,000 people and embodied, for one incandescent moment, the idea that human will could be equal to the worst that history could produce. In his final years, he lived quietly, receiving a small number of carefully vetted visitors, working on his memoirs under conditions of supervision that he accepted with the resigned pragmatism of a man who understood the rules of the system better than almost anyone alive. He dies in the afternoon. By evening, the KGB is in his apartment. Not the next day. Not after the appropriate ceremonial interval. Not following the bureaucratic sequence that the death of a decorated marshal of the Soviet Union would ordinarily require. Within hours, with a speed and a purposefulness that shocked even those members of Zhukov's family who had spent their entire lives inside the Soviet system and therefore believed themselves incapable of being shocked by its methods. They were looking for something specific. This is not speculation. Multiple accounts, from family members, from individuals connected to the military establishment who spoke years later, from the fragmentary documentation that survived, all point toward the same conclusion. The search was not a routine security procedure applied uniformly to all deceased holders of classified information. It was targeted. The agents moved through the apartment with the focused efficiency of people who had a list. Who knew, at least approximately, what they were trying to find. The official explanation, offered later in carefully neutral language, was that the search was conducted to recover classified documents that Zhukov might have retained in his personal possession. Standard procedure for any military officer of his clearance level. Standard procedure does not happen within hours of death. Standard procedure does not involve the level of thoroughness that witnesses described. Drawers emptied, books examined page by page, the spines of volumes pressed and tested, the backs of picture frames removed and inspected. Standard procedure does not generate the particular quality of anxiety that those present recalled in the demeanor of the agents conducting the search. Not bureaucratic efficiency, something closer to urgency, something that, in a different context and a different kind of story, you might call desperation. What were they looking for? To answer this question, you must first understand what Zhukov had spent the last decade of his life doing. He was writing. The memoirs of Georgy Zhukov, published in their official Soviet version in 1969, 5 years before his death, are a remarkable document. They are also, by any honest assessment, a heavily edited document. The version that reached Soviet readers had passed through multiple layers of review, revision, and institutional intervention. Passages were removed. Formulations were softened. Certain names appeared in the text with less frequency than participants in the events would later confirm they deserved. Other names appeared with a prominence that seemed, to careful readers, slightly artificial, as though the emphasis had been calibrated not by the logic of memory, but by the logic of what the current political establishment required the record to say. Zhukov knew this. He was not a naive man. He had survived the purges of the 30s, survived the political turbulence of the post-war period, survived Khrushchev's dismissal of him in 1957, with a contemptuous abruptness that would have broken most men, survived the long twilight of Brezhnev's Soviet Union. A man who navigates all of that without being destroyed has a relationship with institutional reality that is, at minimum, sophisticated. He kept notes, not the notes that became the official memoirs. Other notes, a parallel record, the raw material from which the sanitized official version was constructed, but which preserved what the official version was required to omit. The real sequence of conversations, the real names of people present at critical decisions, the real account of who said what to whom at the moments that determined the course of the war, and by extension, the course of the century. There were also, according to accounts that emerged slowly over the subsequent decades, documents of a different kind. Not military history, personal history. Materials relating to Zhukov's origins, his early connections, the relationships that had formed and sustained his career before the war, made him too large and too public to require the kind of protection that those relationships had once provided. Materials that, in the wrong hands, or perhaps in the right ones, could fundamentally alter the official account of not just Zhukov's life, but of the network that produced him. The KGB found some of what they were looking for that evening. Whether they found all of it remains, to this day, uncertain. Pause. The sound of a reel-to-reel tape recorder running. Static. Then silence again. Let us speak plainly about survival. 1937. The height of the Great Terror. Stalin's purge of the Red Army Command is, by any historical measure, an act of institutional self-destruction, on a scale that defies rational explanation. The Soviet military lost, in the space of approximately 18 months, a percentage of its senior leadership that no enemy army could have eliminated through combat without destroying the entire force. Marshals, generals, corps commanders, divisional commanders, executed or imprisoned at a rate that left the Red Army on the eve of its greatest test, led largely by officers who had been promoted 2 or 3 levels beyond their experience and competence to fill the vacuum left by the dead. Zhukov is alive. We have established this. The question that serious historical investigation must press is not merely why he survived, but how the mechanics of his survival actually functioned. Because survival in 1937 was not passive. It was not achieved by keeping your head down and hoping the machinery of the purge would bypass you through random mercy. It was achieved through active protection. Through the intervention of forces that could, at the critical moment, communicate to the organs of state security a message that was both clear and irresistible. This one is not available. Who could send such a message? The NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, the instrument of the terror itself, did not operate in a vacuum of pure ideological enthusiasm. It was a bureaucratic institution. And bureaucratic institutions, even at their most extreme, respond to power. Not to sentiment, not to argument, not to merit. To power. To the kind of power that can make consequences materialize. That can make an overzealous investigator's own file suddenly become interesting to his superiors. The individuals who possessed this kind of power in Stalin's Soviet Union were, almost without exception, people who had survived themselves by making themselves useful to enough overlapping interests simultaneously that eliminating them created more problems than it solved. People whose network of obligations and dependencies spread wide enough that pulling them out of the structure risked collapsing parts of the structure that Stalin himself needed to remain standing. Zhukov had such people behind him. The evidence is not direct. The direct evidence is precisely what was classified, what was searched for, what was removed from his apartment on the evening of June 18, 1974. But the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming in its consistency. It forms a pattern that repeats across enough data points, across enough decades, across enough independent accounts, that the probability of its being coincidental approaches zero. Someone intervened in 1937. Someone communicated the necessary message, and the NKVD, with the pragmatic efficiency of an institution that understood the difference between expendable targets and protected ones, redirected its attention elsewhere. Now examine what happens immediately after the terror. Zhukov is sent to Mongolia, to Khalkhin Gol, to a military theater that is geographically remote, politically secondary, and strategically significant primarily to the subset of Soviet planners concerned with the Japanese threat to the eastern frontier. From one perspective, this is an exile, being sent to the periphery, while the real action, the real politics, the real competition for position and patronage plays out in Moscow. From another perspective, it is something very different. It is a testing ground, a controlled environment in which a protected asset can be evaluated under real operational conditions, away from the political turbulence of the center, with enough independence to demonstrate capability without the constraints that Moscow's watchful atmosphere would impose. If Zhukov succeeded at Khalkhin Gol, he would return with a credential that no political manipulation could manufacture, an actual battlefield victory, clean and unambiguous, against a modern military opponent. If he failed, the loss would be containable. A remote engagement, a setback in an obscure theater, a commander relieved and replaced. The asset would be damaged, but not necessarily destroyed. Alternative options would be evaluated. He did not fail. The Khalkhin Gol operation was, by the standards of its time, a masterpiece. And the people who had invested in Zhukov, who had arranged his placement, protected his survival, waited through the dangerous years of the purges for the moment when their asset could be activated at scale, those people watched the results from wherever they watched, and they understood that their investment had matured. The timing is not coincidental. Khalkhin Gol concludes in September of 1939. Europe is at war. The strategic picture is reshaping itself with a speed that even the most sophisticated observers find difficult to track. The window for placing the right people in the right positions is narrowing. Within 17 months of Khalkhin Gol, Zhukov is chief of the general staff. From a protected asset in a remote theater to the highest military planning position in the Soviet Union. In 17 months. Sound design, a clock ticking, steady, mechanical, indifferent. The architecture of survival in the Soviet system was, at its core, an architecture of mutual indispensability. You survived because you were needed, not by the state in the abstract, but by specific people within the state who had specific reasons to require your continued existence. and the surest way to make yourself indispensable was to hold or to have access to something that no one else could provide. Zhukov held several such things simultaneously. He held operational military genius, genuine, not manufactured, the kind of battlefield intelligence that could not be replicated by political appointment or ideological enthusiasm. This made him valuable to Stalin, who needed victories and understood that victories required commanders, and that commanders of Zhukov's caliber were not interchangeable with the terrified, underexperienced officers who populated the post-purge Red Army. He held the loyalty of frontline soldiers, a legitimacy that flowed upward from the men who had fought under his command and survived because of decisions he made, and who would follow him into any engagement he ordered. This made him dangerous to anyone who might consider moving against him, because the political cost of eliminating a commander who was genuinely beloved by the fighting forces was incalculable. And he held knowledge, the specific, detailed, personal knowledge of who had done what at what moment in the great turbulent chaos of the war years. Knowledge of conversations that had taken place between military and political figures. Knowledge of decisions that had been made and attributed to the wrong people, or attributed to no one at all. Knowledge of the real relationship between Soviet military operations and the Western Lend-Lease supply chains, of who had coordinated what with whom across the ideological divide that officially made such coordination unthinkable. This knowledge was his insurance policy, and it was the insurance policy that the KGB came for on the evening of June 18, 1974, when the man who carried it in his memory finally stopped breathing and could no longer be asked to keep it confidential through the ordinary social contract of mutual self-interest. The purges did not simply eliminate people. They restructured relationships. When 3 of 5 marshals are shot, the network of obligations and loyalties that those men anchored does not dissolve. It redistributes. It flows to those who remain. The surviving members of any patronage network in 1937 understood with absolute clarity that their survival had been purchased at a price, and that the price was a debt they would spend the rest of their careers repaying. Zhukov's debt was repaid through performance, through the relentless, grinding, extraordinarily costly, but ultimately successful military operations that bore his name, through Leningrad and Moscow and Stalingrad and Kursk and the Vistula Oder operation and finally Berlin. Each victory was simultaneously a military achievement and a financial return. The people who had invested in him received, in each success, confirmation that their capital had been well placed. But the debt was also repaid in a different currency, in access, in the willingness, at critical moments, to use his position to facilitate things that needed facilitating, to allow certain supply logistics to flow through channels that were not entirely official, to provide certain assurances to certain parties through diplomatic and military channels that ran parallel to the official Soviet-Allied coordination, to be, in short, the kind of person that a sophisticated system of transnational interest required in exactly the position he occupied. This does not make him a traitor. The word traitor implies a simple binary, loyal to one side, disloyal to the other. But the world in which Zhukov operated was not binary. It was a complex, overlapping system of interests and obligations, where the interests of the Soviet state, the interests of the Allied powers, the interests of the financial networks that had structured his career, and Zhukov's own personal interests were not always in conflict and were not always aligned. They shifted, they intersected, they required navigation of a sophistication that very few people in any era have possessed. Zhukov possessed it. He was not a simple soldier. He was not the blunt instrument of the official biography. the granite-faced peasant boy who won through sheer force of will. He was something considerably more complex. A man who understood, at a level that very few of his contemporaries matched, the actual mechanics of the world he inhabited. Who knew where the money came from, where the decisions were really made, whose interests needed to be served at each moment to ensure that the next moment remained navigable. He was, in the truest sense, a professional. And professionals in systems of power are never simply what their official title says they are. Final image, a file folder stamped in red. The stamp reads, "Classified." Beneath it, barely visible through the paper, the ghost of a name. Not Zhukov's name, another name, older, connected. The architecture of survival is built from specific materials: money, connections, knowledge, the willingness of powerful people to spend their influence on your behalf. And beneath all of it, the foundation on which everything else rests, a secret. A shared secret that binds the patron to the protégé and the protégé to the patron, with a bond stronger than loyalty and more durable than affection. The bond of mutual knowledge. The bond of, I know what you know, and you know what I know, and neither of us can afford to let the other be destroyed. Zhukov survived the purges because of this bond. He survived the post-war disgrace because of this bond. He survived Khrushchev because of this bond. And the KGB came for his papers on the evening of his death because the bond finally had been severed. The man was gone. The secret was now in the paper. And paper, unlike a man, cannot be instructed to remain silent. The names they were looking for are still in the archive, waiting, patient as stone. Every war in history has two histories. The first history is the one that gets written into textbooks, the movements of armies, the decisions of commanders, the turning points, the sieges, the breakthroughs, the surrenders, the human drama of it, the courage and the failure, and the sacrifice and the grief. This is the history that fills monuments and memorial days and the speeches of politicians who need the past to justify the present. The second history is quieter. It runs beneath the first like an underground river, invisible from the surface but shaping the landscape above it with every passing year. It is the history of who paid for the war, who supplied it, who profited from it, who decided, in rooms that appear in no official record, which side would receive what resources at which moment, and what was expected in return. These two histories are not separate. They are the same story, told from different distances, and the distance you choose determines everything you are capable of seeing. From the distance of official Soviet historiography, the Great Patriotic War of 1941–45 is a story of national heroism, of a people rising to defend their homeland against an existential enemy, of sacrifice so total that the numbers involved, 27 million dead, cities reduced to rubble, an entire generation consumed, resist comprehension and demand instead to be approached through reverence. This is true. Every word of it is true. And it is also incomplete. Because at the same moment that those 27 million people were dying, a parallel transaction was occurring. A transaction of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary scale. A transaction that determined, at least as much as the courage of individual soldiers, which side would ultimately prevail. A transaction that connected the killing fields of the Eastern Front to financial institutions, political establishments, and strategic planning offices in cities thousands of kilometers away. Cities that were never bombed, never occupied, never touched by the physical reality of the war they were simultaneously funding and directing. To understand Zhukov, to truly understand what he was, what he represented, what the system that produced him was actually doing, you must understand this transaction. You must follow the money. Transition, sound design, a ship's foghorn distant, the creak of cargo being loaded, the churn of ocean. $11 billion. In the currency values of the early 1940s, this figure is almost impossible to render in terms that carry genuine meaning for a contemporary mind. It is not simply a large number. It is a number that represents a significant fraction of the entire productive capacity of the world's largest economy at that moment, transferred over the course of approximately 4 years from the United States to the Soviet Union under the program that history records as Lend-Lease. More than 400,000 motor vehicles, 12,000 armored vehicles, 13,000 tanks, 15,000 aircraft, millions of tons of food, enough to provide meaningful caloric sustenance to the entire Red Army for the duration of the war. Steel, aluminum, copper, railway locomotives and rails, communications equipment, boots, uniforms, medical supplies. The official Soviet position on Lend-Lease, maintained with remarkable consistency from the war years through the collapse of the USSR, was one of polite minimization. Yes, Allied assistance was received. Yes, it was appreciated. But the war was won by the Soviet people, through Soviet courage, Soviet industry, Soviet sacrifice. The foreign material contribution was, in the grand scheme of the Eastern Front, marginal. This position was politically necessary. Admitting the true scale of Western material dependence would have compromised the ideological narrative of Soviet self-sufficiency, and would have created an implied debt, not financial, but moral and political, that the Soviet state had no intention of acknowledging. It was also factually unsustainable. Soviet commanders who spoke candidly in memoirs and conversations recorded after Stalin's death told a different story. The food alone, the American canned goods and grain that fed the Red Army through the worst years, was, in the assessment of multiple senior Soviet officers, the difference between a fighting force and a starving one. The motor vehicles transformed the Red Army's logistical capacity in ways that Soviet industry, relocated to the Urals and struggling to rebuild from near-total collapse, simply could not have managed independently. The communications equipment, the field telephones, the radios, the coordination infrastructure, gave Soviet commanders a command and control capability that their German opponents, whose own supply lines were stretched to breaking, could not match in the war's later phases. Lend-Lease did not win the war on the Eastern Front. The Soviet people won the war on the Eastern Front at a cost that staggers the historical imagination. But Lend-Lease made winning possible on the timeline that winning required. And Lend-Lease was not charity. The political economy of wartime alliance is never as simple as the word ally implies. Nations that supply other nations with weapons and food and industrial material in quantities measured in billions of dollars are not doing so from altruism. They are making investments, strategic investments, calibrated to produce specific geopolitical outcomes that serve the supplying nation's interests that may or may not align in the longer term with the interests of the nation being supplied. The United States needed the Soviet Union to absorb and destroy the German military capacity on the Eastern Front. Not because American policymakers felt particular affection for the Soviet system, many of them regarded it with frank hostility, but because the alternative, a Germany that defeated the USSR and then turned its full military weight westward, represented a threat to American interests of a magnitude that made all ideological reservations secondary. The calculation was brutally simple. The Red Army was consuming German divisions at a rate that no other force on earth could match. Every German soldier killed or captured on the Eastern Front was a German soldier who would not be defending Normandy, or holding the Rhine, or threatening the Atlantic supply lines. Every tank destroyed at Kursk was a tank that would not be rolling toward Paris. The investment in Soviet military capacity was therefore an investment in a specific, measurable outcome: the destruction of the Wehrmacht as an effective fighting force, with the Soviet Union bearing the overwhelming majority of the human cost. But investments require management. They require people on the ground, or in this case, at the front, who can be trusted to deploy the invested resources effectively to achieve the operational objectives that justify the investment, and to do so with sufficient reliability that the investors can plan around expected outcomes rather than hoping for the best. This is where the second history intersects with the first. Pause. The sound of rain on a window. Steady, gray, without drama. Zhukov commanded the critical axes. This is not a metaphor or an abstraction. In the most literal operational sense, the major Soviet offensives of the war's decisive phase, the operations that broke the German strategic position irreversibly, were either commanded directly by Zhukov or coordinated through his authority as Stalin's representative at the decisive points. Leningrad, where the siege was broken. Moscow, where the German advance was stopped and reversed in the winter of 1941-42, demonstrating for the first time that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. The Stalingrad counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, where Zhukov and Vasilevsky together planned the encirclement that destroyed an entire German army group and shifted the psychological momentum of the entire war. Kursk, the largest armored engagement in history, where the last major German strategic offensive in the east was broken against prepared Soviet defenses. The Vistula-Oder operation, which carried Soviet forces from central Poland to the Oder River, the last major geographic barrier before Berlin, in a matter of weeks. And finally, Berlin itself. At each of these points, vast quantities of resources flowed. Human resources, millions of soldiers. Material resources, the tanks and aircraft and artillery and communications equipment that arrived in part from American factories via the supply routes through Iran and the Pacific and the Arctic convoys. Logistical resources, the fuel, the food, the ammunition that sustained offensive operations at scales that no previous military history had witnessed. Zhukov managed all of it, not personally in the sense of signing individual requisitions, but in the command sense, the sense that matters strategically. It was his judgment that determined where resources were concentrated, which sectors were prioritized, which operations were accelerated, and which were delayed to build the material conditions for success. This is, in the language of financial management, portfolio allocation. And the entities that had provided the portfolio, that had made the investment in Soviet military capacity that Lend-Lease represented, needed someone in a position of genuine authority who could be relied upon to allocate that portfolio with professional competence, who would not squander it, who would not allow it to be consumed in poorly planned operations that produce casualties without strategic result, who understood that the material being consumed had been provided at cost, and that cost implied obligation. Zhukov understood this implicitly. It was, in a sense, the understanding that had been built into him across the entire arc of his career, from the godparent network in Strelkovka to the cavalry placement, to the military academies, to the protected survival of the purge years. He had been educated over decades in the logic of investment and return. He understood that resources came from somewhere, that they were provided for reasons, and that the person who managed them bore responsibility not only to the chain of command above them, but to the logic of the system that made the chain of command possible. This is not corruption. This is not betrayal. This is something considerably more subtle and considerably more important, the way that sophisticated systems of power actually function, as distinct from the way they describe themselves as functioning. Consider what Montgomery was doing in North Africa and later in Western Europe. Consider what MacArthur was doing in the Pacific. These were men managing resources of extraordinary scale, resources provided by congressional appropriation, by the productive capacity of American industry. by the strategic decisions of a political military establishment that had specific objectives and expected specific results. They reported upward through chains of command. They justified their operational decisions in terms of resource efficiency and strategic outcome. They understood that the armies they commanded were not simply fighting forces, but investments that needed to yield returns measurable in enemy forces destroyed, territory controlled, strategic objectives achieved. Zhukov operated within an analogous logic, though in a political context that required the logic to remain entirely invisible. The Soviet state did not acknowledge external investment. The Soviet state did not acknowledge coordination with Western partners that went beyond the officially sanctioned Allied military relationship. The Soviet state maintained, with rigid consistency, the fiction that the Red Army operated as a purely Soviet institution, funded by Soviet resources, commanded by Soviet officers serving exclusively Soviet interests. This fiction was necessary. It was also, at the operational level, incomplete. And the documentation of its incompleteness, the records that showed the real texture of the relationship between Soviet military operations and Western resource flows, the real conversations between Soviet commanders and Allied military representatives, the real coordination that occurred at levels below the summit meetings and above the battlefield, is precisely what Soviet classification policy spent decades suppressing. Zhukov was at the center of this suppression as surely as he was at the center of everything else. He knew what had to remain unspoken. He had known it since before the war. It was part of the understanding, the implicit contract, that his entire career had been built upon. Sound design, a radio broadcast, scratchy and distant, in multiple languages simultaneously, fading in and out. Then silence. After the war, the world reorganized itself around a new architecture of power. The alliance that had been forged by the common necessity of defeating Germany dissolved almost immediately into the structured antagonism that would define the next half-century. The Iron Curtain descended. The Cold War began. The two systems that had fought side by side against a common enemy now faced each other across a divide that was ideological, military, economic, and psychological simultaneously. In this new configuration, everything that had been true of the wartime relationship became retroactively inconvenient. The material dependence of the Soviet war effort on Western supply chains, inconvenient. The operational coordination between Soviet and Allied military planning, inconvenient. The personal relationships between Soviet commanders and their Allied counterparts, developed over years of working toward shared objectives, inconvenient. The documentation of all of the above, dangerous. And Zhukov was the living embodiment of all of it. He had met Eisenhower. He had met Montgomery. He had coordinated at the highest operational level with the military establishments of nations that were now adversaries. He knew things, specific things, documented things, things that could be verified against records held in archives on both sides of the new ideological divide, that the Soviet state desperately needed to remain unverifiable. This is the real reason for the post-war disgrace. Not jealousy, not Stalin's paranoia about popular generals, though both of those elements were present and real. The deeper reason was that Zhukov, in the new Cold War configuration, had become a liability. Not because he was disloyal, but because he knew too much about the real texture of the wartime relationship, too much about the network that had built his career, too much about the transactions that had made Soviet victory possible at the human cost that it required. He was sent to command the Odessa military district, then the Ural military district, removed from Moscow, removed from access to current intelligence, removed from the conversations that mattered. Not destroyed. Destroying him would have been its own kind of liability, given what he knew and who was invested in his survival. But contained, managed, kept at a safe distance from the center of things. This pattern, elevation to the point of maximum utility, followed by managed marginalization once the utility had been extracted, is the classic life cycle of a high-value asset in any sophisticated system of power. You invest in the asset, you deploy the asset, you extract the return, and then you contain the asset, not destroy it, but prevent it from becoming an independent variable that could introduce unpredictability into the system. The asset understands this. The sophisticated asset accepts it, because the alternative, resistance, exposure, the use of accumulated knowledge as leverage, carries risks that even the most powerful individual cannot fully calculate. Zhukov accepted his containment with the resignation of a man who understood the system completely and knew that the system had, by any objective measure, delivered on its side of the bargain. He had been elevated. He had been protected. He had been given the opportunity to achieve what his talent entitled him to achieve, at a scale that no purely self-made career could have produced. The price was silence. He paid it. For nearly 30 years after the war, he paid it. And when he died, and could no longer pay it personally, the system came immediately to collect the outstanding balance. Final image, a warehouse vast and dim, row upon row of wooden crates stenciled with serial numbers, no labels indicating contents, no indication of origin or destination, just the crates receding into darkness, containing everything and revealing nothing. The money behind the myth was never one country's money. It was never one system's investment, one ideology's project, one nation's strategic calculation. It was something older than nations and more durable than ideologies. It was the logic of capital itself, the logic that finds talent, places it where it can yield return, protects it from the turbulence of history, extracts the return when the moment arrives, and then closes the ledger and moves on to the next investment. Zhukov was the return on an investment that had begun before he was old enough to understand what investment meant. The ledger was closed on June 18, 1974. But ledgers, unlike men, do not decompose. They wait.